this is how the cacophony of fragmented pluralism that Gregg talks about, how all of that can be brought together in a way that for example, well, I'll get there later. Okay. So the four quadrants are formed by this intersection of two axes, the interior, exterior, and the individual and collective. So in psychotherapy, this applies to patient variables and dynamics, the etiology and treatment of psychopathology, therapeutic interventions, and research. And Gregg mentioned this integral methodological pluralism. So this is an extremely general, graphic of the four quadrants. So if you look at the individual from the interior, the upper left, what you have are first-person accounts of self, consciousness. It's the domain of subjectivity. It's the person's experience as felt from the inside. And so the general epistemology is phenomenology. Now, if we go to the upper right, we look at the individual, but now from the exterior. This yields third-person descriptions of organism, brain, and it's the domain of objectivity. Now, this is not behavior in the way that Gregg uses the term, but we're talking about what we can observe from the outside, like good old Skinner stuff. So anything that can be quantified, whatever a video camera could capture. And here the general epistemology is empiricism. In the lower right, we're looking at the collective from the exterior. This also yields third-person descriptions of, but now it's not the individual or the organism, but it's the environment, the social systems, and it's the domain of interobjectivity. The group's behavior from the outside, and the general epistemology here is systemic or ecological analyses. If we go to the lower left, we have the collective, but now viewed from the interior. Wilber calls this second person, but I think it might more properly be thought of as first person plural. But in any case, this is the domain of culture, of worldview, and of intersubjectivity, the group's experience from the inside. And here the general epistemology is hermeneutics. So I don't mean to be like boxing in approaches, but I feel quite confident that if they're not almost solely operating from within each of these quadratic perspectives, they certainly emphasize this. So I don't even know what percentage of people on here are really familiar with psychotherapy. But
a brief description probably would help, but there are a few psychotherapists here, but many would not be necessarily. So
yeah, so like, Freud and the existentialists and Rogers, the person-centered stuff here, they are all really concerned with subjectivity, right? And whereas behavioral and cognitive behavioral approaches are very much modeled after empiricism, and then biomedical, like if you're talking about psychiatry and neuroscience, these are clearly empirical approaches that are looking at things from the exterior. And so just to give one example, Freudian psychoanalysis was considered the first force in psychology, and then behaviorism was the second. And, Freud and Skinner, had, very, very different views of everything on human nature. But look at how they started. I mean, Skinner said, I'm only going to count as relevant data that which can be observed from the outside. Well, Freud is not only concerned with subjectivity, but often unconscious determinants of behavior. So there's no way that when you're starting out with those different assumptions that they're going to come out with the same data. It doesn't mean that one is right or one is wrong. It means that they're looking at the same phenomenon from different angles or perspectives, and therefore their views are complementary.
Can you say a second just about epistemology? I'm not sure everyone would instantaneously, people probably have a sense of that term.
So essentially, that's the study of the nature of knowledge and what you must do to acquire that knowledge. And part of that is the perspective you take on things. So the book that Thomas Kuhn wrote after the Structure of Scientific Revolutions was called, The Essential Tension. And there's a quote in there that goes something like this. Scientists from different disciplines, or not even disciplines, from different theoretical approaches are presented with different data from the same stimuli. Right? So they both observe the same thing, but the schemas and perspectives they take on that stimulus presents them with different data, even though they're seeing the same thing. right? So the perspective from which you're looking at something is going to dictate what you observe, what you notice. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I like the term facts are theory laden.
Yes,
I'm blanking
exactly.
on who,
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly who said that right now.
Karl Popper, I think, right?
Yeah, it could have been. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I do in my theory classes is a thing that Karl Popper would say, and because he would say yes, that you don't observe and then create a theory. Your theory dictates what you observe. So what I do in my classes is say, okay, for the next 60 seconds, I want you all to observe. And so I haven't told them what to observe, right? So you know, some people, these are therapy students, so they say, oh, they were noticing where people's eye gaze went, or they were noticing how many people were tapping their feet, or they were noticing, but the point is there's an infinite number of things. You could have noticed the air conditioning system, or the color of people's socks, or, you know, it's literally infinite. Unless you have a theory that narrows your attention, you're confronted with James's, you know, buzzing, dizzying confusion. So yeah, facts are theory laden for sure.
Can I jump in and just ask like one quick clarifying question? I'm just not familiar with hermeneutics and like much of what's in this bottom left quadrant. So I'm just wondering if you could very briefly describe more about.
Yeah, sure. So hermeneutics is essentially what, you know, the act and science of interpretation. So here, the lower left is the inside of a collective, and that collective can be two people up to, you know, the country or the, you know, larger systems. And so when two people are sharing their experience, you have to interpret what they mean, right? And so one of the interesting things about, I mean, pretty much all of the developments of the last, I'd say 70 or 80 years in psychoanalysis or psychodynamics have gone, whereas Freud was very much an intrapsychic focus, they've all become relational or intersubjective, emphasizing that a person's experience cannot be understood apart from how different groups of people will change a person's experience. For example, haven't you had the experience of perhaps feeling very confident and strong and good, and then a certain person or group of people enter the room and all of a sudden your confidence goes down, right? So it's not as if a lot of these things that people talk about as traits, like self-esteem, they're not stable. They're very much a function of relational contexts. And same thing with like diversity and feminist-centered approaches, that they're very concerned about how we understand difference. Is that clarifying?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. I don't know. Okay. So again, I guess I kind of apologize that the examples here are all psychotherapy, but that's what I do. And this still is, I have charts that are like 10 times as much detailed as this, but this will just give you a little bit more of a flavor. Like, so from this upper left interior individual perspective, as a therapist, I'm concerned about noteworthy patterns in the patient's self-experience, right? So their self-image, their self-concept, self-esteem, self-efficacy. How stable or unstable are they? Do they experience joy, zest, and purpose? Are they depressed and sad? Or are they anxious and revved up? What kind of cognitions do they have? What's their imagery? And consciousness as experienced as mind. Okay, so in contrast, man, I don't know. Okay, so from the upper right, we're looking at the individual from the exterior. If you go to the bottom, consciousness is now described by neurotransmission and the functioning of brain structures, right? So it's not concerned with the experience. They're trying to look at it from an objective exterior perspective, and they describe it, obviously, in the way the brain works. But then you go back up to the top here, and what noteworthy patterns of behavior are going on with this person? What behaviors bring them to therapy, and what behaviors would indicate successful outcome? Also relevant are medical disorders, medication, diet, alcohol, drug use, exercise, patterns of sleep and rest. You see how all of that's basically quantifiable in some way, right? And all of these things are relevant. So you look at the cultural quadrant, and here we're concerned with the patient's meaning-making systems. What's the quality of the patient's relationship with significant others? What's the patient's experience of ethnicity and family dynamics? And really importantly, what is the quality of the therapeutic relationship? And how do both patient and therapist experience their intersubjectivity? And if we're looking at the social systems quadrant, what's the patient's SES? What's the conditions of their neighborhoods? What environmental stressors or comforts are they experiencing? Analyses of interpersonal dynamics, and then various treatment contexts have an effect on how the therapy plays out. And again, so if we look at depression in the 4 quadrant, in the upper left, the client is likely to experience sadness, loss of pleasure and loss of interest in pleasurable activities, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, difficulty concentrating, etc. And also, how do they interpret events such as the death of a loved one, divorce, profound loss, etc. In the upper right, what can we observe, right? So the person may be tearful, they no longer engage in pleasurable activities, there may be significant weight loss or gain, psychomotor agitation or retardation, there probably are lower levels of available serotonin, they're likely to socially withdraw, and this is what Gregg captures in his term behavioral shutdown. And then what cultural meanings are assigned to someone who's depressed? In some cultures, they're viewed as sick or mentally ill. They may be viewed as lazy or irresponsible, or some cultures view them as heartbroken, hexed, or bewitched. And there are often a lack of satisfying intimate relationships in people who are depressed. And finally, what social systems contribute. So these could be economic, educational, or medical. The person may live in poverty, drug, or gang-ridden neighborhoods. They may go to poor or dangerous schools. They may have minimal access to medical care, and they may experience racism, sexism, classism, or ageism. So in other words, the 4 quadrants are aspects of and perspectives on our world that yield 4 interrelated yet irreducible domains or perspectives. So integral meta-theory posits that a comprehensive description of any phenomenon requires that one accounts for these 4 irreducible perspectives. So any questions about the quadrants? Again, hopefully you saw that, you know, even if you're not a therapist, hopefully you could see that dynamics in each of those quadrants could be central to any given person's struggle with, in the example I gave, depression.
Right. Yeah, so I really do believe that this is a very, very, in terms of big picture thinking, this is one of the best big picture insights. So in 1995, Wilber has this insight, or at least he publishes it first in Sex, Spirituality, and Ecology. And it's also, I think it's useful to note, I mean, that's implied in what Andre said, but it's a 2x2 frame of reference for understanding perspective. So, and one distinction then is interior versus exterior. The other is individual versus collective. I'll just reiterate what Andre is saying there. And the idea that these are actually frames of reference whereby people enter the stream of thought from these particular positions and then gather data accordingly, I think is one of the more broad and very useful comments about epistemology. In other words, how we know and what data we use that has been offered. And it has been applied across so many different fields. And Andre, of course, is an expert in psychotherapy. And I can vouch for the utility of organizing the various schools of thought in psychotherapy around these quadrants. Many schools of thought just stay with one particular quadrant, and that makes them particularly limited from my vantage point in terms of if you want a holistic understanding of the phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, because what you still have, I mean, psychotherapy is really no longer that young. It's been around for like 120 years, and you still have an awful lot of, I think Gregg calls them horse races, or just, you know, competition. You know, is CBT better than psychodynamics? What about DBT and transference-focused therapy? And, you know, if you are, and there still are, radical or extreme behaviorists, those therapists are not interested in your experience. They're not interested in your dreams. They're not interested in basically the client's experience. They're interested in the environmental contingencies that are maintaining various problematic behaviors. And so it's just a good example about, I think there's behaviorism offers a tremendous amount of powerful insights and interventions, extremely. But if you just stay within that upper right perspectives, you are blind to all of these other important perspectives.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Leland mentioned in the chat, generally mentioned 6 blind men and the elephant. In fact, I use that in my, well, I'm talking about the unified theory, but it's the same basic, I think Andre and I agree, it's the same basic principle that many of the paradigms are oriented sort of as horse races, and then they have their own sort of horse race blinders on, both in a competitive sense and a somewhat narrow perspectival sense. We want to see the whole horse race or the elephant, whatever metaphor you want to use. So, and the epistemology, the quadrants, I think, are a great framing to allow you to see the range, the whole, etc.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Andre, you used the word irreducible. In what sense are the 4 quadrants in your mind or in Wilber's mind irreducible?
So perhaps that's not the best choice of word, but what I'm meaning there is that you cannot reduce the insights of one quadrant to another. Another quadrant cannot capture what the other quadrants capture, and therefore you can't reduce one to the other. Does that make sense?
Indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And by the way, I also used that parable of the blind man and the elephant in the 2004 theories text, because it's just a great metaphor for people who have their blinders on, you know. So Mike may have a lot to offer here when it comes to developmental issues. And that's where I would say I was very fortunate to have Michael Mahoney be my mentor in my doctoral program. And some of you may know he has a 1991 book called Human Change Processes that was, I've never seen a book raved about by therapists in every tradition. So Bandura, Beck, and then a whole host of James Bugenthal as an existential humanist, and like Strupp from the psychodynamic tradition. But what's interesting is that there were 140 pages of references. It's a huge book, and it's all about how we change, how we develop. But he rarely talks about stages. And I do think that stages are, well, I think Gregg helped me understand the difference between a theory of human nature and a theory of psychotherapy. And so if we're trying to understand humans, like in a psychological sense, to me, developmental models are one of the most important, because for example, if you're really egocentric, you really don't value, other people, you're going to interpret a whole lot of life very different from somebody who's, say, ethnocentric. At least an ethnocentric cares about people if they're similar to them. But then if you're more of a world-centric person who, like a Buddhist, wants to have compassion for all sentient beings, I mean, these people have very different values and different behaviors, and they experience the world differently. And in therapy, empathy is considered absolutely essential. And I don't think you can really understand somebody without understanding generally how they are developmentally. At the same time, stage theories are often presented as like, a staircase, like you go from one step, and obviously development does not happen so neatly like that. Like yesterday I was at this stage, and now today I'm at this stage. But this is what I got into Wilber. So Gregg was right. 1995 was when Wilber came up with the quadrants, but he had been writing for 2 decades before that. And he had this huge, what he calls spectrum model of development. And all levels refers to integral meta theories, constructively integrating what is arguably the most complete spectrum of human development, from birth to the farther reaches of human nature, to use Maslow's term. As such, his spectrum model spans 3 broad realms. The pre-personal and personal realms each have 3 stages, and they have fairly strong empirical support in the developmental psychological literature. So these are very, very, very general descriptions, but the pre-personal refers to development from birth to early childhood. Margaret Mahler was an object relations theorist who spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours of watching infants interact with their mothers. And the title of one of her books is called The Psychological Birth of the Human Infant. All right, so when a mother gives labor, the baby is physically born, but there's not really, properly speaking, a psychological entity there right then. And so development here is largely bodily focused. The child is differentiating physically and emotionally. And during this time, their psychological self or person has yet to fully emerge, which is why he used the term pre-personal. And again, there's lots of different stages here, but the broad personal realm is later childhood to early adulthood. Here, development is more mind focused. So you're learning social roles and mental rules. And during this time, our selfhood becomes increasingly autonomous, stable, and coherent, hence the term personal. Now, the suprapersonal, which he used to call transpersonal, is not realized by most people. And he used to have 4 stages here, but he changed that with what was called the Wilbur-Combs lattice, to where it's you can have different types of spiritual states. They're not really, I don't believe these are real stages in the same, I don't think they're nearly as stable as the preceding stages. But here, one's life can become more potentially self-actualizing and spiritual. During this time, one may recognize that your deepest self is not merely the separate, isolated mind, individual self. Alan Watts called it the skin-encapsulated ego, but something including yet transcending the personal self, something more akin to a spiritual, but not necessarily religious, capital S self, hence the term suprapersonal. So this is Wilber's view. I and other interval scholars are more agnostic with regard to the ontological structure of reality and our ultimate nature. But yeah. So I think this is really important. We do not conceive of developmental stages or levels as reified structures. So rather we view them as probability waves, which suggests not a concrete structure residing within the individual. Rather, an individual developmental level is fundamentally a function of that person's residing in a psychological space from which the probability is high that the specific patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting that characterize a given level of development will manifest themselves. So, lines, types, states in the self system. So, integral theorists recognize that people have many different aspects or lines of experience and functioning, and these are not often equally developed, right? So it's common to encounter people who are cognitively very developed, but emotionally or interpersonally much less so. So it really doesn't make sense to say how developed is a person. It's how developed are they in what ways, right? It's kind of like Gardner's multiple intelligences, similar to this. Wilber posits that there are approximately 24 different lines that develop through identifiable stages, such as cognition, morality, self-identity, object relations, interpersonal values, needs. Now, some of these have pretty good empirical support, but I think the majority of them do not. Clinically, attending to patients' developmental lines is important to help us narrow attention to those aspects of patients that may be most implicated in their current struggles. And so we'd focus in on that. Types. So tailoring a therapeutic approach to a patient's personality type may be important because different types of people emphasize different ways of being in the world. So personality types are radically different from developmental stages. Any type can manifest at any level. And that's a pretty, like Nancy McWilliams has a classic psychoanalytic diagnosis book, and she says the same kind of thing. But again, some personality typologies have, good demonstrated reliability and validity. For example, the 5-factor model, temperament, and attachment style. Whereas others, like the Myers-Briggs type indicator and the Enneagram, have virtually no good psychometric properties. However, I think even the latter can be clinically useful, especially if they are recognized and used more as metaphors rather than constructs with really solid psychometrics. So the basic gist is that an integral approach says that therapists will better serve patients if they assess their patients' types and attentively work with rather than against their patients' preferred styles of being in the world. This is something that I don't actually consider central to my work, but it's typical of integral theory. Now, states, so I've done some empirical research studying integral therapists for a course of a year with patients, and videoed it all and analyzed all that stuff. And the biggest takeaway was that whereas Wilber ascribes the most import to quadrants and levels, these integral therapists spend most of their time adjusting their approach dependent upon the state of consciousness the client is in that moment. And that's something that I definitely do too. And I think most therapists do that, but this goes contrary to kind of the ranking significance of these constructs. But whereas levels or stages of consciousness can be thought of as relatively enduring structures or traits, and when I say structure, I'm talking about relatively stable patterns of events in consciousness. In contrast, states of consciousness are much more temporary and fleeting. So their states of consciousness are another important component. And so whether that's induced by drugs, fasting, or contemplative practice, or an aspect of a person's presenting problem, most episodes of depression, mania, psychosis, etc., are just that. They're episodic states. Most people are not permanently psychotic or permanently depressed, right? These are states. I found the most important states in psychotherapy are affective or emotional states, what are called self states, and defensive states, right? People defend against their emotions and disturbing thoughts far more than I think most therapists appreciate. And if you're not working with those defenses, you can't help them get to their core adaptive emotions. And depending on their state of consciousness, patients may be more or less open to certain counseling interventions, and the therapist's own state of consciousness has tremendous impact, right? A therapist who's deeply, deeply present and empathically attuned is going to be more helpful than someone whose mind is all scattered. So the self, last but not least, we attend closely to each patient's self because this is really where the action is. The self is the seat of a host of significant operations and capacities, such as identification, organization, will, defense, metabolism, and navigation. Not only is it the self that balances, integrates, and navigates the various levels, lines, states, and so forth, the self is also the experiential center of each individual's psychological universe. But very importantly, again, we should not reify the self into a thing or a noun. The self is the process or activity of constructing one's sense of identity. So, basically, just like Gregg's unified approach, integral psychotherapy is a meta-theoretical approach to psychotherapy unification, and it informs clinical decision-making by its formal assessment, its understanding and treatment of psychopathology, its principles of interventions, its critique of much traditional psychotherapy research, and its call for integral methodological pluralism in psychotherapy research. So I don't know if we want to stop here. I could go into more detail about how the quadrants arrange hundreds of therapeutic interventions, and also one of the things I'm most proud of is, so it's one thing to appreciate the quadrants, but the quadrants don't absolve anybody of learning all of the different approaches and interventions within each quadrant, right? So just because you know integral theory doesn't make you a better therapist. I mean, you have to know behavioral interventions and psychodynamic interventions and cognitive interventions and humanistic interventions and all this kind of stuff. So, I think I did a very thorough job showing how, so it's very common, I'm sorry, I'm starting sentences, but it's very common to find articles that says anxiety is caused by a person's physiology, or anxiety is caused by genes, or anxiety is caused by trauma. Well, the truth is that most disorders in the DSM are very overdetermined and multifactorial, right? You've actually got dozens, if not, many dozens of factors that can interrelate to yield some kind of DSM disorder. And so I think understanding the etiology is very relevant to treatment, because 10 people who are depressed may not be depressed for the same reasons. It's kind of like you can have a headache because you have a brain tumor, or because you ate ice cream too fast. Those need different interventions. And the same thing with DSM disorders. So would y'all?
Yeah, I think that I would like to take a pause here, or at least that's what I'd vote for, and then really see if we can open this up to some conversation. Certainly we can go back to some of those slides. Andre, that was fantastic, just what I was hoping for. So let's see if there are, let's go ahead and do the woohoo. Let's see if there are questions. And then there are a couple of things I want to talk about from my vantage point about how I interpret Wilber from my unified vantage point. But first, let's just open up, see if there are any questions before we go in that direction based on what people saw. And if they have certainly if you have background knowledge about integral, Andre's the person to ask. Mike.
Andre, that was really well done. I have pieces of knowledge about Wilber, and you really put them together for me in a really clear and coherent way. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you've validated some conceptions that I've had about the theory. I asked you before about the irreducibility concept. I have to admit that the four quadrants, I don't quite see them as irreducible. Leyland had written that he thought they were orthogonal. An interesting idea. In fact, I actually feel as though the four quadrants don't have meaning unless that the four quadrants seem contradictory to me. If they are in some way irreducible, I don't see how you get from one quadrant to another. Or stated differently, what's the glue that holds the four quadrants together? I don't see any glue there yet. And in my opinion, the glue that holds the four quadrants together is in the left lower corner. It's the intersubjectivity frame. So perhaps you might call me totalizing it, wanting to have. You said something about horse races. Maybe that's my horse race in your formulation. Let me say why. Because I don't think we can have a quote unquote subjective frame independent of the intersubjective frame. I cannot know my inner states, at least in any semiotic way, without the benefit of the language that is mediated by intersubjectivity. And similarly, if we did not have intersubjectivity, behavior would be incoherent. I couldn't look at another person's behavior. I would see the other person as a robot exhibiting a suite of inscrutable behaviors that I had to make inferences about inside the other person. But we see guilt, we see intention, we see goals because of the a prioriness of our intersubjectivity. And the same could be argued for the lower right-hand corner. So my problem with Wilber has always been that there's a claim to integration, but it seems to break down to these four elements, and I'm back and forth amongst them. I'm not sure what the center is. For me, the center would be some sort of intersubjective frame. I wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, I think it's a really great point. And I will, there's a larger issue that you brought up. Now, when it comes to psychotherapy, so a proper integral therapist should give equal attention to all four quadrants. But I definitely draw upon the lower left approaches the most. Not to say I don't draw upon the others, but I do think that the work of a therapist is so deeply about understanding how a person's experience is a function of their, say, attachments and things like this. But I think perhaps you're looking for something more than what Wilber's really offering with the quadrants, because I don't think that there is something like a center to them. I think his point is that, so it may be a little less ambitious, and this is where I think Gregg's work, I often say, is at a much more granular level than integral theory, because for two reasons. For one, most of the specific ways that phenomena in different quadrant interact have not been thoroughly understood. But secondly, I see the purpose of the quadrants as merely saying that to understand anything fairly comprehensively, you do need to look at it from these different perspectives. And although I totally agree, so I don't know if you're familiar with the intersubjective field theorists like Stollerow and Atwood, but they'll say very much that, you know, yes, intersubjectivity is the precondition for having an experience. You know, that, you know, the thought experiment, if you were just plopped down on an island and, well, I guess like the people who say they were raised by wolves or whatever, they're going to have a profoundly different experience than somebody. Well, just look at people who are brought up by you know, traumatizing parents versus, you know, really healthy parents. They have totally different experiences of the world, of the same exact. If they were put in the same classroom or wherever, you know, the traumatized person is not going to trust people. They'll be vigilant. They'll be this. So I agree with you about the primacy of intersubjectivity for humans, but I also think that that does not disregard neuroscience or behaviorism, which would be in the upper right, because those disciplines yield different data about people that to me are very, very, very important and relevant. So I don't know if that really, so I think you're right. There is no glue that holds them together. They are perspectives to be taken. And again, each quadrant may have dozens of perspectives within a given quadrant. I just give a few examples in each, you know. Now, what's your reaction to that? I'm curious.
I thought that when you said that, I agree. I feel validated when you said that that there wasn't the glue, and I resonate deeply with your kind of summation, which says that in order to understand any phenomena completely, we have to look at it from at least these four positions, from these, because that's the totality. I agree with that. I guess I would still thinking that the intersubjectivity is primary. I think we can get to the other ones through there, even though I think that you're absolutely right. Any theory must have these four frames, if you will.
Okay, thanks. Leland?
Yeah, I argue that the glue is reality, or perhaps the full story would be another way to say it, okay? So one of my favorite phrases is, reality is our common ground, okay? And the difficulty comes in that we only get a glimpse of it, okay? Reality is too vast and too dynamic for anyone to comprehend. We can only get a glimpse from it. So the glue is reality, or the whole story, or everything is going on. I view the four quadrants as as describing viewpoint space, which is, have I thought of it this way? Have I thought of it this way? Have I thought of it this way? Have I thought of it that way?
Mm-hmm. No, Wilbur actually, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, Leland, that, I mean, just to get a little bit more technical, Wilbur says that he differentiates what he calls quadrants and the quadrivium, that he says any sentient being actually has these four domains. And then, but the way I use it, which is how he usually uses it, is that they are also perspectives on any given phenomenon. And I think that's what you're saying, is that reality would be the glue, and then we can take these different perspectives on it, each of which just gives us a partial glimpse.
Correct. If I were to, and I do this rather recklessly, if I were to add to it, I would argue that there's a third axis, which I will call time. So if you look at it as a snapshot, it's a state view, and reality is what it is in this state, but probably be complete, and you address this with levels, you'd want to look at over time to see how do they migrate over time, if you want to comment on something that would be more trait-based or development-based.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cole?
Yeah, I guess I think it's useful even to have this sort of conceptual framework, but I'm wondering more about applying it clinically and sort of thinking about, like, I guess one thing that just popped into my head is that a lot of people would say that, like, kind of the ultimate goal in the development of psychology is to get as much of the science as possible to the people in a way that's like practically useful. So like meeting people where they're at with science in a way that's like adaptable. Say that's one thing that I've sort of became more interested in. But like I guess maybe in the context of a situation where like a particular evidence-based or manualized treatment um, is effective and might be thought to be the best way to approach a particular problem, how would you approach something like that from an integral approach? Is it a matter of like looking at the issue and then looking at it in terms of all four of these quadrants and then finding what the best approach is, or kind of sprinkling a bit from every approach, or kind of how do you take a psychological problem and then apply this framework to it in a way that works in multiple situations?
So that's a good question. So Wilbur describes the basically integral theory as kind of content free. So the most common criticism I get from students, and I think it's a totally valid one, is that, you know, when I present like the quadrants, it's like, and I think Gregg wrote a very nice book review of my recent book, and he said something like he's never had a student disagree with the idea that it's important to take these four perspectives into account. But they're left then saying, okay, that makes sense on kind of a big picture, you know, scale. Now, what do I do with clients? And so this is a non-prescriptive approach. So I have a footnote in my recent book where I asked about a dozen integral therapists who have all kind of published and, you know, are considered like, expert in some way. And, you know, if I had to pick one approach I use the most, it's these relational psychodynamic approaches. There are other people who are identified primarily as cognitive behavioral, others who are existential humanistic. So, and provided that they don't just stay within that frame, but think about the other quadrants and think about levels and states, I think they can rightly call themselves integral. So it doesn't tell anybody how to do it. It leaves that's why I said learning integral theory won't make you a better therapist. You have to then learn all these different approaches, and then you use your clinical judgment about what approaches to use with a given person. That being said, I've written 3 critiques of empirically supported treatment research. And Gregg can probably talk more eloquently and informed about this because he did so many of these random clinical trials with cognitive therapy and Aaron Beck, but they are so deeply flawed. I mean, the number of assumptions they make and all of the, selection criteria, so that in order to maintain, and a good experimental design, you get data that then doesn't transfer to anybody. I mean, there are always people with just one disorder, and probably you can't be suicidal and you can't have had psychotherapy before. And so it's like, whatever results you get, man, it's minimally relevant to the real world. So I'm not a big fan of evidence-based approaches. That to me is not like some big capital that for me. At the same time, CBT has the most empirical evidence, and, using cognitive, I like to think of like, I have switched my training of students from teaching like theories per se to saying, look, humans have, the cognitive domain, they have the behavioral domain, they have the relational domain, they have, and therefore we need to learn interventions that will address those, right? And so it really, like Gregg came up with the metaphor of like, each approach is like standing on a mountain, their own mountain, and they can't really see the whole mountain range of therapy. Whereas unifying approaches like his approach and integral step back and say, okay, they survey everything, and then as best they can, and then say, okay, what's what's going on that's most wrong with this person. And if it's primarily their schemas, okay, I could use a cognitive approach or maybe a psychodynamic approach. If it's these certain kind of behaviors, then I'll use exposure approaches with, behavioral or whatnot. So it puts a lot of pressure on the therapist to make those clinical decisions, because at one point I fantasized about having a manual of integral psychotherapy. But after doing that study, yeah, there's no way. There's no freaking way. So.
Yeah, I'll just echo that and just say that for me, what I got to was, in terms of, at least in psychotherapy, we go a lot of different directions for this, but I am guided by principles and processes that keep the system constrained in certain regards and keep me guided on certain guideposts, but also then have an arena for the indigenous relationship between myself and the unique other who sits across from me, and to create a context for us to embark on our own dance and journey through their own, discovery and adaptive transformation. That it's therapy of N of one very often. Now, there are some exceptions to that that I would use, but generally that's certainly my own frame. Mike, you were going to say something, or see if others
Yes.
have.
I wanted to, in a sense, first I wanted to ask Leyland what he meant by reality when he says that reality is the common ground. And the reason I want to ask the question, because he also invoked the elephant metaphor, and I want to critique the elephant metaphor. I don't think the elephant metaphor works very well, the various parts of the elephant. The idea of that means that there's an elephant, and that the people who are looking at different parts of the elephant see the elephant, if you will, as the elephant is, and they're just not able to see the full elephant. The better metaphor, it seems to me, is you've got people looking at different parts of the elephant through different glasses, and the glasses transform how it is that I actually see the elephant, how I construct it in the first place. So the idea that there's a reality that we can know, that provides the structure, I think it's a problematic one. That unless we take into consideration how the knower participates in the knower transforms the known as much as the known transforms the knower. So for Leyland, my question becomes, when you think about reality, do you think about it as an external something that we look at from different perspectives and see, or does reality include the constructive aspects of the knower organizing that thing in the world in such a way? Because I don't think you could take the knower out of the known.
So 2 weeks from now, I'm going to be giving a talk called Seeking Real Good, and we'll go into this in a little bit more depth. People who doubt their reality, I ask them to slap themselves, or I ask them whether they open doors before they go through them, okay? So the idea that there is no reality, I have a problem with, okay? And I confess to being an engineer. Now, with respect to the elephant, I think you don't want glasses, okay? There's a book called Destructive Emotions, written by Dan Goleman, which reports on a session they had with the Dalai Lama, and they asked him, what is the destructive emotion? And he said, anything that inhibits our ability to see what is there, to see rather truly. With respect to when I see something, if I pick an object, two things are going on. One is that there are brute facts about many objects. Okay, the Earth does go around the sun. The hydrogen atom does have one proton, blah, blah, blah. So a brute fact is the way it is in the absence of an observer. Other things are true, which is many observers will pick up only some portion of what is there, okay? So anybody's viewpoint or comprehended facts or whatever is only ever a very partial view of what is there. It's also true that our perception systems are largely constructed, okay? And there are many examples of this, starting with the blind spot and so on and so forth. So it's true that there is an elephant. It's true that each observer gets only one glimpse of the elephant. It's true that the perceptual system of each observer is constructed and may be distorted. But I argue in favor of something that's called consilience, which is that if you have a number of conscientious observations of the same phenomenon, they will converge towards an integrated description of that real phenomenon.
Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to introduce a metaphor that, let's see if that helps us clarify some of this conceptual stuff. So if we can combine psychotherapy with sports, for example, and let's say that if the context is that, you know, there's a game, in the context of game, when you look at these four quadrants. So you can look at it from an individual player's perspective, what they think and how good they are, etc. You could videotape, using Andre's comment earlier, you could videotape that one player and you could observe that person. Then you could look at it from a coach's point of view. So depending on the, you know, like you set the arena and then you set the, what is the game, and then you talk about these four quadrants. And maybe, Andre, you could take this sports analogy and take it a little bit further and help you know, explain to us these four quadrants in that context. Maybe that'll be helpful for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a useful metaphor. So I mean, so each player is going to have their experience of the game, and those experiences, even among top, you know, world-class athletes, they don't necessarily have the same experience of the same sport, right? Then if you look at the upper right, what a video camera could show, it's probably best to think of a team sport like, say, basketball. You could focus that camera just on one player and then analyze all the amazing thing he or she is doing, right? But that behavior is not, so just take basketball. The behavior, if you just had the camera focused just on that person where you couldn't see anybody else, offense or defense, is not completely meaningless at all, because you could still see, wow, look at the skill there, the footwork, the handwork, everything. But to really understand it, you need to have the video showing the offense and defense and how the person's interacting with everything. And then, very importantly, the interior of the group. Think about, teams that really have good relationships and respect one another, as opposed to having more adversarial or competitive relationships among themselves as a team, right? And also just like having, the team's confidence, again, things that can't be captured with a camera. I think all of those are very important.
I can recommend the book, The Boys in the Boat. It's about a crew team in 1936. So crew obviously requires an enormous amount of synchronicity between the individuals. So these are the rowers and how they get into sync. It's a really excellent book about sort of a collective, intersubjective, implicit inner coherence that is achieved to create a whole. And they talk about the intuition to cultivate that, and when it goes awry, and to be a really effective crew team, you have to have unbelievable synchronicity in the rowing. So,
well, I think that made me think about like a really good jazz band, right? To where most of it's being improvised, and that involves, the best jazz players not only know all their chops individually and all the scales and all this stuff and are creative, but they're listening and playing based on what they're hearing in that moment, right? And so that can be analyzed, right? All those notes could be transcribed. That would be a lower right? And analyze them. But that experience, my God, so I was an amateur musician, and when I started getting into more complex like bop jazz, it was above me. I never got good at that. But that has to be such an altered state, to where, your own chops are so good you don't even have to think about them. The best players are listening to other people more than they're actually focused on their own playing. So I just think that's that intersubjective domain, to where it's just like a mystical, that to me is like almost like a mystical experience. It's only, I'm sorry, I won't try to stay too long on the jazz, but it's because I know several professional jazz musicians. Some of that, I don't know how many people like jazz here, but some of the improvisations where 3 or 4 people are kind of soloing at the same time, that man, I would have bet my life that they had worked that out and like composed it so many times. There's no way that this person did that and then this person did that in a way that it all fits together. And every jazz musician I know says, no, that's completely never done twice like that. And it's like, that to me is the Gregg's crew version. It's like, yeah, that, and I know Mike's smiling because we're emphasizing the intersubjective, but yeah, it's powerful stuff.
Yeah, what Mike's question brought for me is like, are we looking for a glue, or are we really looking for some, pipes, some bridges, some connection between the 4 quadrants? Like, so when you observe somebody in a particular state with certain traits, let's say in a particular situation, and you try to find an explanation. So if you look in all quadrants, you'll find some dots on top left, some on top right, some. So potentially it's like to have a better picture of reality, potentially. That could be the way.
One thing I'd like to do is I'd like to dialogue then a little bit about bridging this to the unified theory. But let me check and see if there are any other kind of additional questions. Maybe we can get back to the spirit question. That's an important one. Any other quick questions about that? So let me share a little bit about what my view is of with a particular focus on the quadrants, how I translate those quadrants, and then we'll come back, dialogue about spirituality, and then we'll probably be getting near time. So let me share my screen real fast. So for me, I've shared this depiction. Actually, I'll go right here. So for those of, we're in the We Thrive, still the remnants of We Thrive resides here. And I'll just provide a little bit of backdrop here for those of you that may not be familiar with Wilber's really grand vision. And I think it's a really very important point to make because I believe it's true that modernity, the power of the scientific way of thinking has actually dominated other knowledge systems. Wilber talks a lot about the recognition that prior to the dominance of science, we had sort of an embrace of a pluralistic, onto epistemological emphasis on the good, the true, and the beautiful. Okay, the good, the true, and the beautiful, which actually corresponds in some ways to the we relates to the good, like how do we decide what is good for us? The beautiful actually relates to the I. I'm not going to get into that. And the true relates to what is it. The it is true. And what we built with the modern scientific revolution is a particular way to understand the it, and a specific emphasis on identifying various kinds of objects and how they behave in the world. And that really then much of the modern scientific enterprise has tried to essentially privilege then the upper right quadrant, okay? Meaning that it evoked and emphasized an exterior object level analysis that would then detect how it behaved. Now, one of the things that I will argue that Wilber does that's different than what the unified theory does is Wilber not only creates a version of these two distinctions between the interior and the exterior and the individual and collective, but in particular, I focus on the interior versus exterior, whereby the interior is the more spiritual and humanistic elements versus the exterior is more scientific. I argue that actually Wilber also kind of conflates the epistemological claims of exterior versus interior with an ontological model of the way the world works. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at Wilber's upper right, you will see, and Andre mentioned this, he talks about both behavior, as say a Skinnerian might talk about it, and he talks about brain causation, which you would of course see if I'm going to try to take a picture of somebody in terms of say an fMRI. And he yokes those together in relationship to sort of his version of what behaviorism and a physicalist view of the universe is. But a physicalist view of the universe is a particular kind of ontology, meaning it makes claims about what reality is. a spiritual view of the universe is a different ontology, okay? The unified theory attempts to create a map that affords us this an appreciation of these different epistemological views that also embraces a consonant or commensurate or conciliant view of ontology, meaning the map about what our theories of reality are and what the actual reality is. That would be the ontic realities, the actual reality, and ontology is our theory of them. So what do I mean by that? Let me bring this home here in terms of saying, so here are the 4 quadrants, okay? You have the upper right, which is exterior object, okay? In the normal Wilberian view, this would go from like a particle to an atom up into the brain and the various levels of the brain, okay? With emphasizing the higher cortical levels, which would correspond then to this view. This is the interior human phenomenological view, which would start at the perspective. I wish I should have the diagram here, but I could explore it real fast. But anyway, it would go at what's called a sort of a particulate panpsychic view, which would be the inside, say, of even like an atom. Wilber basically has a pan-spiritual view, I believe, so that there's a little bit of psyche interior perspective in matter, and then cells, and then higher animals, and then ultimately consciousness. Here is the interior, interior collective and the exterior holistic. So what you see in this diagram or this representation is the way the unified theory interprets these. And I'll just focus most particularly on this level, which basically says that I think Wilber's analysis of the upper right should be reinterpreted not from a materialist flatland view, but a universal behavioral view. And that's afforded by the periodic table of behavior. Here's the big picture of the periodic table. So whereas Wilber offers a singular continuum that ends in brain, I argue that from an exterior perspective, we can attend to objects that operate at various dimensions across matter, life, mind, and culture, and part, whole, group of wholes at a foundational level. And ultimately, this gives rise to what I argue is the 4 flaws of scientific analysis, where we have particle physics, periodic table of the elements, molecular chemistry, then we get into genes and molecular biology, the study of cells, the study of multicells, colonies, botany. Then we get up into animal behavioral science and neuroscience. Mind 1 is how animal behaves as whole, and then sociobiology, and then finally, in the 4th dimension, we get into human cognitive science and symbolic justification and linguistics, human psychology and self-conscious justification, and then the building of families, groups, nations, etc. So what I argue is that Wilber basically has an incomplete ontology or an inconsistent ontology that varies between the quadrants, and the tree of knowledge attempts to provide a more coherent, conciliant, onto-epistemological understanding. And one of the ways in which it does that is it translates the upper right from a physicalist interpretation of that quadrant to one that is a behavioral writ large interpretation. So I figured I would just share that review, see if Andre has any reflections about that, and see if there are other comments in relationship to it.
Well, in short, like we've talked about before, I mean, I think that you're right about that. And, you know, I look forward to fleshing that out in more detail in a paper or something like that. But no, I think that you're onto something very important there.
So that's one of the arguments I make about modernity is, and actually it builds off of Wilber's critique of it, at least modern science, is that it conflates the scientific understanding with a materialism. And I think we should actually have it as a universal behaviorism. I know Mike totally embraces that term through and through. But anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But I wanted to offer that. And Andre and I have had some dialogue about, if time permits, and my hope is that it does for both of us, is that we're going to try to generate a statement about these two perspectives. Because actually, I believe Wilber's attention to the epistemological quadrants lines up very nicely, ultimately, with the version that I offer in terms of a more ontological and sort of descriptive metaphysical perspective. The last question, yeah, go ahead.
I think that your periodic table of behavior just by itself is just so badass.
Thanks, friend. Thanks. Are you waving off, Leland, or you have a question?
No, I was waving off the Leland.
I'm waving off. I got to go. I know I raised the question that you're just about to get to now, but I have another thing in half an hour, and I haven't had dinner, and I can smell dinner going.
Perfect.
Happy wife, happy life is what I get out of all of this. See you guys.
Right. Of all the integral quadrants, it's actually wife that ties it all together for us, right, Mike? So, yeah, so I think that it does behoove us to at least make a comment about spirituality. How I think about it, I can share a little bit. But Andre, do you want to give a little bit of thought about how you interpret Wilber and where you are in that concept of spirituality? And certainly anybody else that has questions or comments, please, at any juncture, just jump right in.
Well, so my critiques notwithstanding, there's still a tremendous amount of import, I think, in his spiritual scholarship. And one of the things that he points out is that if you look at any of the major religions, he says they all have legitimate and authentic components. And the legitimate, he said, is usually based on a system of kind of exoteric beliefs, the doctrine of the religion. It helps the person legitimize their experience. So if you just think of a Christian, the belief that you're going to be reunited in heaven with your loved ones helps you deal with life's vicissitudes in a major, major way. Of course, the doctrines of the different religions can't all be true, right? Because they disagree when you talk about at the level of the doctrines, they disagree greatly. But there's a saying, I don't know who to attribute it to, but like when theologians get together, they argue. Theologians from different religions. When monks of different religions get together, they smile, right? And so there is a contemplative branch of every major religion. I grew up thinking that the meditation was just in the East, but for the first 400 years of the Christian church, the whole emphasis was on developing Christ consciousness in each individual. And I can't remember which pope said, no, what that contemplative stuff is for the monks, and you have to use word prayer, for the lay people. And same thing, Judaism has Kabbalah, Islam has Sufism. So, there are rich contemplative, meditative traditions in East and West. And what I once took as a type of evidence or proof that these spiritual experiences were rightfully shedding light on these ontic matters was how similar the experiences were at a deep structural level long before we had intercontinental communication. And so a Hindu might commune with Krishna, whereas a Christian might commune with Jesus. But that's still the same thing. Obviously, the surface structure is Krishna versus Jesus, but at the deeper structure is the individual communing with the Godhead. And so they're really, and there's been a lot of written about the stages of these spiritual experiences that often seem, again, based on these 1,000-year-old documents, that people in different traditions had these kind of deep structural similar experiences, people who are really engaged in meditation. I find that, yes, so Wilber calls that authentic spirituality, the stuff that actually, and he points to various sources of data, which I think he often misinterprets, but evidence that, engaging in meditation and various types of selfless service and things like this can actually speed up development through various stages. I'm not so sure about that. But I have little interest in legitimate spirituality, which focuses on, again, the beliefs of different religions. But I think the contemplative component is so powerful. And that, I think, reveals to us our shared humanity. And also, it's the cultivation of virtues that are good for the individual and for the world. Yeah.
So did that, Mike, I saw had a question. Is that how then you understand the concept of the spiritual, what you just said at the end right there? Because Mike asked, can you tell us how you understand the concept of the spiritual? Does that?
Yeah. I mean, Wilber's view of the spiritual is that, so he uses spirit with a capital and a lower s, and that as you go from pre-personal to personal, super-personal, the highest stages would be spirit with a low s. And then he would say spirit with a capital S is the sort, so he draws this from Sri Aurobindo, who is a 20th century, you know, Hindu guru, philosopher. And this is, Aurobindo said that spirit is primary, and spirit involves itself into matter, which provides the potential for matter to then evolve. And that's very much, that is Wilber's ontology, that spirit is, capital S, is primary. And so if he's drawing a diagram with the stages, he says spirit with the capital S is the page that the diagram is drawn on. Okay, and that we can develop up to spiritual stages, but that spirit is what is real, and that matter will decay. Matter is not ultimately real. See, the problem is, so I found very little offensive with a lot of Buddhism for a long time, but Nietzsche showed me that even Buddhism, which to me is far less objectionable than the monotheistic religions, there is a life negating quality to it.
Can you, in the interest of time, because we do have to go probably soon, we all want to hear about what you think.
Okay.
What's your take on spiritual?
Yeah, to me, spiritual is how you experience the world and how you relate to others. So again, that's why I think of it as, again, being mindful, being able to be in the moment, being grateful for, my God, we all have so much to be grateful for. Being kind, compassionate, forgiving. To me, that's a spiritual life.
Right. So for me, that's what I've evolved to, basically. I now embrace the concept of soul and spirit as useful language terms. Soul for me then refers to each of our subjective functional form. What I mean by that is your first person perspectival experience of being, the part of you that disappears, at least for me, when I sleep and comes back online. If I dream, I'm the only person that has access to that dream. I can narrate it. So it is my first person experience of being. And what my spirit is, fundamentally, I actually now identify as a syntheist, which I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic, and I'm a syntheist, all of these things, and they're not inconsistent, I can explain. But a syntheist is somebody who embraces the concept of God, or embraces the idea of the ultimate concern, or the idea that there is an ultimate good that we can align our lives by, like in a Aristotelian ultimate good sense. Any of those, so ultimate concern, ultimate good, concept of God kind of idea. And it is when we call ourselves to extend beyond the concerns of our ego and what's just the self-interest, and transcend that into being part of something else, a larger humanity of what is potentially good, then that fundamentally is the calling of the spirit. So I think that would overlap a lot with what you're saying in terms of the virtues and seeking. I think it overlaps with Confucianism. It really overlaps with a lot of the wisdom traditions. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah. Oh,
I want to ask Michael, because I read the chat. What are you thinking right now about spirit, the word spiritual? Like, what does it mean to you?
I think I really liked what Andre said at the end. I took what he was saying to mean that spirituality is the Wilberian spirituality with the small s. And so for me, spirituality, well, I don't believe in anything other than the material. I'm a materialist, but I do believe that consciousness emerges from biological processes, and that the spiritual is my identification with something that is beyond me. And so when Andre talks about forgiveness and love and the virtues, I mean, that makes me feel whole.
Oh yeah. So yeah, self-transcendence, I think, is a key part. I should have said that as part of spirituality. I mean, that Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and thus spake life herself to me. I am that which must ever surpass itself. To me, that you know, yeah. So self-transcendence, I think, is a key component. I can't believe I left that out, but thank you.
It's right at 7. About any other kind of thoughts, reflections, things for us to chew on, final questions?
I just want to thank Andre. I always enjoy hearing you explain it, and I showed up for you because I know how special you are as a presenter. So this has been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And thanks everybody for giving me a platform.
Yeah.
That's
Thank
great.
you. Amen. Thank you, brother. Very much appreciate it. I look forward to our continued conversations about the integral unified interface and all of that. But that was really, really helpful. And I do really encourage people. I've certainly been very influenced by both Andre and the quadrants. And I really do think they provide, if you want a big picture understanding, a really, really useful heuristic.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
All
you.
righty.
Bye.
I'm going to send out a note. I have recorded this. At least I started about 5 minutes late, but I'll give people 24 hours to, if they have any objections, then I won't post it. If we do, I'll share it with others. I think it's very valuable.
No objections here. All right.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks.